It's official, it's spring, and there's nothing that cheers me up more at this time of year than the sight of the sun shining through the petals of narcissi, especially these hybrids of Narcissus cyclaminius. You can always tell them because their petals are reflexed and backspreading and the trumpet's just a little bit extended. They're, I think, the most elegant of all narcissi, and I'd have them in my garden all year round if I could. The great thing about the last couple of weeks is that the sun came out. Buds have begun to swell and the soil has dried enough for me to get on and plant it in this shade garden I'm making under the oak trees. You can see now the full effect of the canopy and the second story I'm planting of shrubs, and then the lower story of perennials that can cope with shade. Things like hellebores, lily of the valley, heucheras, and hardy geraniums, and the spears already pushing up of Iris sibirica, the Siberian iris. I've not finished planting yet, and one of the things I want to get in is the star magnolia, Magnolia stellata. About the first magnolia to flower, always a bit risky because of the frosts, but when it comes out and it doesn't get frosted, just look at it. The important thing is it must be planted without disturbing the roots. This soil of mine, of course, you saw a couple of weeks ago, terrible stuff. Really heavy clay. Now you can see the manure. I've already tried to improve it by forking some stuff in, but there is no earthly point in planting a magnolia with a sensitive root system in solid clay. You've got to pep it up a bit. Those of you who are old enough to remember Arthur Billett on Gardener's World and that lovely soil he had at Clack's farm, oh, but he's looking down at me and laughing. What it does mean, now I've emptied the hole larger than I would need for that, is that I can work in some of this topsoil. I don't normally like importing it, but when a plant needs to grow, it needs to grow. I want to put a load of it at the bottom of the hole. What this lot will do is tease those roots out into decent soil, and then by enriching the rest of it around the edge with more topsoil, it'll eventually coax them out, and they'll then be strong enough to make their own way in the soil. Just fork this in now, and then you're ready to plant. And then get this out of its pot, and you'll see now the root system fairly well established in there. Lower it into the hole and check then that the surface of the root ball is about level with the surface of the soil. And in this kind of soil, it doesn't want to be any deeper. And then you can fork this back in and feed that back in now, making sure that most of the topsoil goes right around the root ball. And then, even though it's clay, you do need to firm it a bit to make sure there are no air pockets there. What it needs now is a mulch of well-rotted compost or manure around it. Now, a magnolia that big is going to cost you a few pounds. You can save money by getting a much smaller one and being patient and waiting for it to grow. But you can also save money, as I am doing here, by digging up some plants from other parts of the garden and dividing them. Hardy geraniums are brilliant in shade. This one is Geranium Phaeum, the Morning Widow. You can tell it by the blotches, the purple blotches on its leaves. And this is Claridge Druce, one of the best ground cover geraniums there is. Grows about knee-high with pale pink flowers veined in deeper pink. The way to divide them is very easy. Get yourself a spade. This is a little border spade. You're usually aiming for pieces about as big as your fist. I can get a good 3 out of this. There we are. Now, the second clump, I think I can divide with my hands because these stems are much longer, and you can see if you just break it apart here, you can get quite a few clumplets, you might call them, out of each piece. They look pretty tatty because they've got some of last year's leaf stalks on, but that'll grow and that'll make a new plant that'll flower this year. And then use your spade to ease out a hole, slide it in. It doesn't need to be very deep. I'm planting them between 1 foot and 18 inches apart because that way I'll get quite rapid cover. But at least my soil is workable, which you can't say for Pippa's just a few miles away. Still, she's finding other jobs to do in her kitchen garden.
It's only a few weeks since I planted these strawberries, but already they've put on some really good-looking new growth. Now, I did say I was going to get on and start sowing my vegetable seeds, but the soil here is still a little bit too cold and wet for me to want to risk doing any direct sowing. So instead I'm going to concentrate on sowing some of those vegetables which do well if you raise them from seed sown in trays. Now, a handful of seed like this may not look like much now, but in just a few months' time it should turn into a basket full of this. This week I'm starting with tomatoes. I'd be lost without a plentiful supply of them for sandwiches, salads, soups and scrumptious pasta sauces. I'm concentrating on growing varieties of tomato which are either suitable for outdoor use or which you can either use in a greenhouse or in the open. So all I've got are half-size seed trays. I'm just making holes across it using a dibber. You can of course use just a pencil if you want, you haven't got a dibber, it does just as well. And then once the seeds are in place, just use the dibber to cover them gently with a little bit of compost. I'm going to put several different varieties in the tray because they should all germinate at about the same time. So each row or couple of rows needs its own label. I'm going to do much the same for the melons, but this time I've decided to sow the seed into individual cells. That way I need to prick them out even less often. I've chosen a variety called Sweetheart because they say that even if you grow them outdoors, provided you choose a sheltered position, you should be able to get a fairly decent crop. Now both the melons and the tomatoes have been sown into dry compost, so that's going to need a good bit of water. And the best thing I like to do here is to put a seed tray without any holes in the bottom and just let those trays of compost soak up the moisture till they're glistening with wetness on the top, and then pop them into the propagator for a bit of heat. Next, Calabrese. It's about the only brassica I actually enjoy eating. I love it lightly steamed. I've chosen the variety of Calabrese known as Trixie, and it's smashing if you're trying to garden organically because it's resistant to clubroot, and as you know that can absolutely wreck pretty well any brassica. I'm just going to pop a couple of seeds into each of these cells, and then later on I'll weed out the less vigorous of each seedling to choose the best one to plant out. Now this is a really nifty device because it's a self-watering set of propagating cells. So I hope that when I finish sowing all these seeds, I can simply pop the lid on, put some water in the base and let it get on with its own devices. And put this on the windowsill, and then it's time to collect my seed potatoes because those are now fully chitted and it's time to plant those out. Freshly lifted new potatoes, boiled and drenched in butter and chives. At the beginning of the series I got my seed potatoes chitting, and now the earlies are ready for planting. I'm putting them into a trench about 4 to 6 inches, that's 10 to 15 centimetres deep, and spacing them about 12 inches, 30 centimetres apart. Now I'm concentrating on earlies largely because this is a new piece of land, so I'm expecting problems with wireworm, that horrible little pest that tunnels into the potato tubers, and also with slugs, just like everyone else. So by putting in an early crop, you miss out on a lot of those problems because you lift the crop well before the problems get underway. Then all you have to do is simply cover the tubers with the soil that you lifted out of the trench, making sure there's an inch or two of soil on top of each one and firming it down gently as you go. Now if you're in a colder or more northerly part of the country, you'll find you may need to wait a couple of weeks before you even plant your earlies. But because I want these earlies to be extra early, I'm going to cover the entire row with one of these miniature polytunnels, which stretches out rather like a concertina, and that will help to keep the soil just that bit warmer, keep off any excessive rain, and also protect the young shoots from frost. And hopefully that way I can lift my crop just that little bit earlier. Now, in a couple of weeks, I'll be back to do the direct sowing of some of my vegetable seeds, including leeks, and weather permitting, to get on and plant my onion set. But in the meantime, I've got a lot more of my seed potatoes to plant.
It was last September that I direct sowed these sweet peas into the open ground where they're going to flower this year. The traditional autumn sowing, just to see if it worked. Well, they've come up, at least most of them have, but there are gaps over there, and I am wondering if it isn't better to sow in spring in pots and then transplant them where they're going to flower. Time will tell. I'm gapping up with these greenhouse raised sweet peas. I like to plant a single pot full like this in each hole rather than dividing up the plants. There's sort of, what, 5 youngsters here, but they can leg it up there. If I just gently ease that soil around them, they'll soon grow away, and I'll tie them in when they get a little bit bigger. If you want sweet peas in your garden this summer, and you didn't sow last autumn, and you haven't got a greenhouse, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter a jot, because you can sow them outdoors where they're going to flower right now. Here in my blue border, the hyacinths are just coming into bloom. I wish you could smell them, it's wonderful. And there's a patch of soil here behind them. I've forked some organic soil conditioner into the ground. I'm not going to use a wigwam of canes here. Instead, I'm going to use brushwood, twiggy pea sticks. You buy them at your garden centre for growing peas up. Push them into the ground at 6 or 9 inch intervals. They're usually either hazel or birch, these. Now, they're nothing like as tall as a wigwam of canes, but they do look a darn sight more natural. And when my little thicket's in there, I can now sow my seeds, tipping them out into my hand and putting them into the ground with God's own dibber, my finger. Push your finger into the ground for about 1 inch, just beyond that first joint, and then drop a single seed in. Firm back the earth. Plant 2 seeds at the foot of each piece of brushwood and keep them watered. Then you'll have flowers right the way up here during the summer. Time now for part 2 of Gay Search's Back to Basics guide, Living Space.
Last week, we showed you how to decide what you want from your garden, how you're going to use it and so on. Over the next few weeks, we're going to show you how to turn your ideas into reality. And we're starting today with the real nuts and bolts, surveying your garden.
One of the first jobs, obviously, is to find out how big the garden is. Now, if it's a new plot, you may possibly be able to get a plan from your builder or developer. If you haven't got that, you'll have to measure it yourself.
And that's really very easy. All you need is another person, the longest tape measure you can get hold of, and a very rough sketch of the garden on a piece of paper so that you can write in the measurements in the right places as you go. The best way to measure up is to start from a fixed point, like the back corner of the house, and measure the length of the garden.
11.9.
Write all the measurements down on your rough plan as you go along. Do both sides, because it's amazing how few gardens are perfect rectangles, even when they look as if they are.
12.10.
Then measure the diagonals from corner to corner. These will be invaluable in finding the position of the corners if the garden isn't regular in shape. Okie doke. Finally, measure the width at each end. The next thing we need to do is to see which way the garden faces. Line the plan up with the back of the house. I think that's all right, don't you? North.
Yep.
So mark the north point.
That's pretty much in line straight down the
Yeah,
garden.
more or less due north. So we know now we're going to get sun over here in the morning, over here in the afternoon, and down the bottom of the garden in the winter if we're lucky.
Yes, but almost no sun at all today.
So what I'm going to do now is draw up a much more accurate scale plan of the garden. And to make my life really simple, I'm going to use this. It's a scale ruler. And what it does is do all the calculations for you. Now, I've already drawn in the house because we know those walls are straight. And we've drawn in the left-hand boundary because that runs parallel to the house for half its length. So we know that that's straight too. But we also know from when we measured up that the garden isn't entirely rectangular. It's an odd shape. And that's why taking this diagonal measurement was so important, because using a technique called triangulation, that's going to enable us to fix that corner exactly. So all you do is set your compass to the measurement of that diagonal, 13.05, put it into our fixed point here, and scribe an arc. Then we look at the other long boundary, that was 12.1 metres. Draw another arc, and where those two cross is the corner. All you do then is join that to the house, one boundary, top boundary, and that gives you an accurate plan. And now the fun can begin, actually working out the layout of your garden. What a lot of people tend to do is decide they're going to have a flower bed here, and another one here, and another one here. And what's left over then becomes the lawn, or if they're not having lawn, the hard landscaping. Well, I don't think that looks terribly good usually. I think it's much better to start the other way and decide on the bones of the garden first, the path, the patio, the lawn, make them good strong shapes, and then what's left over becomes your planting areas. Now you can do this with coloured pencils, but I actually think it's much easier to use coloured play paper, these lovely bright colours. You can cut out your shapes and then you can manipulate them, move them around, and of course it means you don't have to keep drawing a fresh plan each time. This is what a lot of people would do, a great big slab of lawn in the middle and very narrow borders around the outside. But it's like a room with all the furniture pushed back against the walls. Not a good use of space and not particularly interesting visually. And the fact that the borders are so narrow means that you couldn't grow any decent sized plants. I think we could do something a bit more interesting. An oval lawn creates a more symmetrical effect, and these smooth curves soften the rectangular lines of the garden, as well as creating good deep planting beds in each of the corners. That's a bit different, isn't it? By creating these really strong diagonal lines, we've emphasised the width of the garden, and so it appears wider. But apart from changing the shape of the garden, we've also created 4 useful areas. You could get a couple of big shrubs in here and a tree. I mean, imagine something this high and probably a bit higher. It begins to draw your eye and stops it whizzing straight to the houses behind. It also creates a little secret corner. Now, this is the perfect place for a seating area because it faces southwest, and so it'll get the evening sun. And the final corner, we've got enough room to put a small shed. Well, that's the theory sorted. Next week we're going to start putting it into practice by looking at the 3 Ps: paths, patios and privacy.
Loads of useful advice there. Look forward to next week's instalment. I've been pretty busy myself this week, finishing off my bamboo garden, and I'm really chuffed with it because when the sun shines, the shadows of the bamboos slant across the pebbles. And I found a very reasonable way of paving it too. These squares of decking, I got 12 of them for £48, and now I can tiptoe through the pebbles. All it needs is a water feature. Joe Swift's been making one that I think would fit here pretty well in this week's garden cutting.
Making water features can be a bit daunting, but here's a really easy way of customising a prefabricated kit to make a sculptural focal point which will enhance any garden. Kits like this are now widely available. Now with this one I want to finish flush to the ground, so I need to dig a hole the depth of the tank. Soft sand's a good thing to line the hole with. It stops the tank getting punctured and it also helps get the water feature level. For a water feature this size, you only need a small pump. This one turns out about 600 litres an hour, which is plenty. This copper pipe's going to form the spout. It's important to get a snug fit over the top of the pump. I've got some beautiful Chinese slate here, which I'm going to mark up and drill holes through the centre. Drill the hole a little bit bigger than the copper pipe and then stack the slates, spacing them with this polystyrene. This landscape fabric's going to stop the weeds coming through the soil. I'm going to finish it all off using these Scottish beach pebbles. You always need more of these than you think. Fill it up and plug it in, and don't forget to use a circuit breaker.
That was good, wasn't it? And so's this, an orange tree growing in my conservatory in a large pot. I come in every day for my fix of scent because the blossom opens at the same time as it's showing its fruit. They're really very easy to grow. Well, most of the time they are. Some people, though, do seem to have difficulty with them. If your citrus tree looks like this one, instead of full of foliage, flowers and fruit like mine, you could be doing one of several things wrong. They are very thirsty. Never let them dry out completely. But also, they want the right compost. And this one is growing in a compost based on bark. Now, in my experience and in my conservatory, they thrive much better when they're growing in this John Innes No. 2 potting compost. So what I want to do with this chap is tip him out. Look at that, really poorly rooted in there. Hardly any root on it at all. But clearly a very unhappy little grapefruit. So I shall scrape off a bit more of this compost and then repot it in a pot which is actually smaller than the one it was in originally. They don't like over-potting. Crock in the base, and then some of that Johnniness in the bottom of the pot. Sit that on it so it's not too deep, and then filling around it with more compost. Firm around it with your fingers. And the thing about Johnniness is, of course, it can be firmer than soilless. There it goes. Now it's time for the kindest cut of all. I know this plant is laden with blossom, but it's very anemic, and I'm going to cut it back really hard. It will be blossoming still by the end of the year. Look for the dead and brown ones first. This can come out right back to the stem, just like that. Got one or two more up here. Get rid of those. And then take off these top shoots, cutting back to just above where you can see a bud and a thorn emerging. It can now be watered in and go into a cool greenhouse or conservatory or on a windowsill. You mark my words, it'll be sprouting before you know where you are. But not all citrus that need attention are in quite such a poor state. Look at this one here. You can see on the surface of the compost roots are appearing, and that's a sure sign that it needs repotting. So move it on into Johnniness number 2. And if you're in a hard water or a limey area, remember to inquire of your nurseryman about the rootstock. All citrus plants, or most of them, are grafted. You can see the union here. Poncirus is a rootstock which is pretty lime tolerant, and that way you'll end up with lots of green leaves. Feed your citrus, of course, once a week during the summer, and they can be stood outside from June to September. Hopefully they'll end up like this with these little tiny fruits on this one, the calamondin orange, Citrus mitis. Whatever the weather this weekend, enjoy your garden. Ta-da!
There's more practical advice and inspirational ideas on the way next here on UK TV Gardens as we head into the ever-popular gardener's world. So stay with us.